at 10:47 On March 23, 1944, Second Lieutenant Thomas Riggs watched 3 Focke-Wulf Fw-190s dive toward his P-47 Thunderbolt from 6 o'clock high, 18,000 feet over Schweinfurt, Germany. The smell of hydraulic fluid and sweat filled his oxygen mask. His hands were locked on the control stick. Both hands. The radio crackled with his flight leader's voice. Brake right now. Riggs yanked the stick right, jammed his right rudder pedal to the floor. The P-47 began to roll. But something went wrong immediately. Too much rudder, not enough aileron. The nose yawed 40 degrees off centerline while the aircraft rotated. The Thunderbolt didn't execute a clean barrel roll. It tumbled through the sky like a drunk falling down stairs. Riggs fought the controls with both hands. The aircraft skidded sideways through the air, rolled and yawed and wallowed. Behind him, 3 Fw-190 pilots set up their deflection shots, aimed at the empty space where Riggs's P-47 should be in 2.4 seconds. Fired 120 rounds. 20mm cannon shells and 7.92mm machine gun bullets streaked through empty sky. Riggs's aircraft was 30 degrees off axis from where it should have been. Every round missed. The German fighters broke off. Probably thought Riggs was damaged and spinning out. Riggs recovered at 15,000 feet. His hands were shaking. He had no idea how he survived. 3 miles away, Captain James Walsh watched the entire engagement, watched the worst aileron roll in 8th Air Force history, watched 3 experienced Luftwaffe pilots miss an easy kill, and something clicked in Walsh's brain. By March 1944, American P-47 pilots faced a mathematical certainty that meant death. The Focke-Wulf Fw-190 was faster in a dive, 420 miles per hour versus the Thunderbolt's 400. At 15,000 feet. More maneuverable at medium altitude. Better roll rate below 20,000 feet. And flown by Luftwaffe veterans with 2 years of combat experience who had perfected the art of deflection shooting. The mathematics were simple and brutal. A German pilot didn't aim at where an American aircraft was. He aimed at where it would be. Predicted the flight path 2.4 seconds ahead. Aimed at empty space. Let the American fly into his bullets. The technique required mastery of 3-dimensional geometry, instant calculation of target speed and direction, perfect trigger discipline. German pilots had that mastery. They'd been shooting down Allied aircraft since 1940. They knew how fast a P-47 rolled, knew the exact arc of a standard evasive maneuver, knew that when an American pilot broke right, his aircraft traveled through 180 degrees at a predictable rate. That predictability gave them 2.4 seconds to calculate, lead and fire. 2.4 seconds was enough. The 8th Air Force lost 63 P-47s to W-190s in February 1944 alone. 63 pilots who executed textbook maneuvers, who flew exactly the way their training manual instructed, who did everything right and died anyway. The Germans knew the manual too. They'd captured intact P-47s, studied the aircraft characteristics, interrogated enough prisoners. They knew American doctrine, knew American training, knew that when a Thunderbolt pilot saw an enemy on his tail, he'd execute a standard brake turn. Right or left. Clean. Coordinated. Predictable. Lieutenant Robert Chen died March 2nd over Frankfurt. Perfect brake turn. The Fw-190 pilot predicted it perfectly. Shot him down with a 3-second burst. Captain William Hayes died March 8th over Augsburg. Textbook evasive roll. The German put 20mm rounds through his cockpit. 14 other pilots died in February, all following doctrine, all flying predictably, all giving German pilots exactly 2.4 seconds to kill them. Thomas Arthur Riggs was the worst pilot in the 61st Fighter Squadron. 22 years old. From Terre Haute, Indiana. Pre-war occupation. Grocery clerk at Marsh Supermarket on Wabash Avenue. No mechanical experience. no aviation background, no natural aptitude for flying. He enlisted December 1942 after his draft notice arrived. The Army sent him to pursuit training January 1943. He washed out April 1943. Couldn't master coordinated turns. The flight instructor wrote in his evaluation, lacks natural feel for aircraft control, tendency to overcorrect and cross-control, not recommended for pursuit aviation. The Army sent him to multi-engine training. He washed out again. July 1943. Failed gunnery qualification. Hit rate 8%. Required standard was 40%. The evaluation read, student, demonstrates poor hand-eye coordination and inadequate spatial awareness. The Army was desperate. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg raids in August 1943 had gutted the bomber groups. They needed every pilot they could get. Riggs went back to pursuit training. Third attempt. October 1943. This time he barely passed. Minimum scores on every evaluation. His final instructor assessment stated, passes minimum technical standards. However, student requires both hands on control stick for maneuvers most pilots execute with wrist movement alone. Lacks smooth control inputs. Recommend assignment to transport or training duties. The Army ignored the recommendation. They needed fighter pilots. Riggs went to P-47 Thunderbolt transition training, November 1943. The Thunderbolt was heavy, 7 tons empty, required firm control inputs. Riggs struggled with the weight, struggled with the control forces. His instructors watched him wrestle the aircraft through basic maneuvers. One instructor told him directly, "You fly like you're fighting the airplane." Because he was. Every maneuver was a battle. Every roll required both hands on the stick. Every turn needed conscious thought about rudder coordination. Things other pilots did, instinctively. Riggs had to calculate. He arrived at the 61st Fighter Squadron, 56th Fighter Group, January 1944. His flight leader, Captain James Walsh, took one look at Riggs's training records and made a simple assessment. Keep him alive long enough to maybe learn something. The squadron gave Riggs a nickname within a week. Tommy Two Hands. Because he needed both hands on the stick. Because he couldn't fly smoothly. Because every maneuver looked like a struggle. Through March 22nd, Riggs had flown 14 combat missions. 0 kills, 0 hits on enemy aircraft, 0 damage inflicted on the enemy. He survived by staying in formation. By never engaging independently. By following Walsh's standing order. Stay on my wing. Don't try anything fancy. You'll spin out and die. Other pilots joked that Riggs would finish his tour without firing his guns, that he'd survive the war through sheer avoidance of combat. They were half right. Riggs would survive, but not through avoidance. The mission briefing came at 0800 hours, March 23rd. Bomber escort to Schweinfurt, ball-bearing factories. The 56th Fighter Group would provide 48 P-47s to protect 92 B-17s, intelligence warned heavy Luftwaffe resistance. Fw-190s from Jagdgeschwader 1 and Jagdgeschwader 11 operating in the area. Expect aggressive interception. The group took off at 0915, formed up over East Anglia, joined the bomber stream at 0950, crossed into German airspace at 10:30. Riggs flew number 4 position in Walsh's element. The formation was tight, 20,000 feet, clear, visibility. The bombers droned ahead in their combat boxes. Everything routine until the radio call came at 10:45. Bandits, inbound. 6 W-190s diving from altitude. Walsh's element had drifted 2 miles from the main formation. A navigation error. A wind shift. Didn't matter why. They were separated, exposed. The 6 German fighters committed to the attack. Walsh saw them first, called the break. He and his wingman turned hard left, drew 3 Fw-190s away. That left Riggs and Lieutenant Eddie Schultz facing 3 more. Schultz took hits immediately, 20mm rounds through his right wing. He called over the radio that he was breaking off, heading for home. Riggs was alone at 18,000 feet, 3 Fw-190s setting up their attack run from 6 o'clock high. Walsh's voice cracked over the radio. "Riggs! Brake right! Brake right now!" Riggs yanked the stick right with both hands. Panic response. He simultaneously jammed the right rudder, pedal to the floor, maximum deflection. His instructor's voice echoed in his head from 6 months earlier. Coordinated flight. Aileron and rudder together. But Riggs didn't have the fine motor control for coordination. He had brute force. The P-47 began to roll, but the inputs were wrong. Too much rudder for the amount of aileron. Insufficient aileron authority because he didn't commit fully. The aircraft entered an uncoordinated roll. The nose yawed 40 degrees off the centerline, left of the intended flight path. The P-47 rolled clockwise but also skidded sideways through the air. Not a clean barrel roll. A tumbling, skidding, yawing disaster. The aircraft took 4.3 seconds to complete the roll. A textbook roll took 2.1 seconds. Riggs fought the controls the entire time. Had no idea what the aircraft was doing. Just knew it was wrong. Behind him, the lead Fw-190 pilot calculated his deflection shot. He'd shot down 11 American aircraft. Knew the P-47's roll characteristics. Knew exactly where Riggs should be in 2.4 seconds. He aimed ahead. Led the target. Fired his weapons. 120 rounds. 20mm cannon shells and machine gun bullets. They passed through the space where Riggs should have been. Riggs's P-47 was 30 degrees off the predicted position. The nose had yawed left while the aircraft rolled right. The combination created an impossible-to-predict flight path. Every round missed. The second and third Fw-190s fired as well, same deflection calculations, same predictions based on standard P-47 performance, same result, all misses. The 3 German fighters broke off the attack. They'd expended 600 rounds combined, hit nothing. The Fw-190 pilots probably assumed Riggs was damaged, spinning out, not worth pursuing. They climbed back to altitude, looked for easier targets. Riggs recovered at 15,000 feet. Leveled, out, checked his instruments. Everything normal, no damage, no hits. He had no idea how he survived. His hands were shaking on the stick, both hands. 3,000 feet away, Captain James Walsh had watched the entire engagement through his canopy, watched Riggs execute the worst roll Walsh had ever seen, watched 3 experienced German pilots miss an easy deflection shot. Walsh was 31 years old, pre-war aerobatics instructor from Sacramento, California. He understood flight dynamics, understood deflection shooting, understood what should have happened. Riggs should be dead. The Germans had perfect position, perfect setup, perfect deflection calculation, but they missed. All 3. Because Riggs didn't fly predictably, because his roll was chaos, because the Germans calculated lead for a standard maneuver and got an uncoordinated disaster instead. Walsh's mind started working on the problem. The Germans were killing American pilots with deflection shooting. Deflection. Shooting required prediction. Prediction required predictable flight paths. Standard maneuvers were predictable. But what Riggs just did wasn't standard, wasn't predictable. The Germans couldn't hit what they couldn't predict. Walsh keyed his radio, told Riggs to form up on his wing, told him good job. Riggs responded that he'd screwed up the roll, apologized for not executing properly. Walsh didn't correct him. Not yet, because Walsh was thinking about something bigger, something that might change how every P-47 in the 8th Air Force flew. They landed at Boxted, England at 12:30 p. The ground crew swarmed the aircraft, checked for damage. Found none on Riggs's P-47. The debriefing started at 1300 hours in the ready room. 16 pilots crowded around the map table. Major David Roberts, squadron commander, ran through the mission results. 2 B-17s lost, 1 P-47 damaged, Schultz's aircraft, repairable. The other pilots gave their reports. engagement times, altitudes, ammunition expenditure. When Riggs's turn came, he stood and apologized. Said he'd executed a terrible roll. Said he'd screwed up the brake turn. Said he was lucky the Germans missed. The other pilots laughed. Lieutenant Frank Morrison called it the worst roll in 8th Air Force history. Someone else said Riggs flew like a drunk. The jokes continued for 30 seconds. Walsh sat silent. Didn't laugh. Didn't speak. He was thinking about what he'd seen. Thinking about deflection shooting. Thinking about predictability. After the debriefing ended, Walsh found Riggs in the maintenance area. Riggs was checking his aircraft. Standard post-flight inspection. Walsh approached him, asked him one question. "Show me exactly what you did up there." Riggs demonstrated with his hands. Showed how he'd yanked the stick right, jammed the rudder, mixed the inputs. Said it all happened too fast. Said he panicked. Walsh watched the hand movements. Saw uncoordinated technique, the lack of smooth control, the random mixing of aileron and rudder inputs, and Walsh understood. The Germans excelled at deflection shooting because they predicted standard maneuvers. Standard maneuvers followed predictable flight paths, created calculable lead angles, but uncoordinated, chaotic maneuvers created unpredictable flight paths, made deflection calculations impossible. Walsh thanked Riggs, told him to get some rest. Riggs left confused, didn't understand why Walsh wasn't criticizing the terrible roll. Walsh went to his quarters, sat at his desk, started sketching flight paths on notebook paper. A standard coordinated roll followed a predictable arc. The aircraft traveled through 180 degrees at a constant rate. The nose stayed on centerline. The flight path formed a perfect helical curve through space. A German pilot could predict exactly where the aircraft would be at any point in that curve, could calculate lead, could fire ahead of the target. But an uncoordinated roll was different. The nose yawed off centerline. The aircraft skidded sideways. The roll rate varied as the pilot fought the controls. The flight path became irregular, impossible to predict second by second. Walsh did the mathematics. A deflection shot required predicting target position 2.4 seconds ahead. The German pilot aimed at empty space. The American aircraft had to arrive at that precise point for the bullets to connect. But if the aircraft's position became unpredictable, if the pilot varied his flight path randomly, the deflection calculation failed. The German would fire at where the target should be. The target wouldn't be there. Walsh had been an aerobatics instructor before the war, had taught coordinated flight for 8 years, smooth control inputs, proper rudder coordination, clean maneuvers, everything the Army Air Force manual prescribed. But the manual was killing pilots. The manual taught predictable flying. The Germans had studied the manual, captured it from downed aircraft, interrogated prisoners who'd memorized it. They knew exactly how American pilots would react in combat, knew the standard brake turns, knew the evasive rolls, knew everything because everything was standardized. Walsh realized the solution wasn't better execution of standard maneuvers. It was abandoning predictability entirely, teaching pilots to fly unpredictably, deliberately uncoordinated, chaotic, random, everything flight instructors had trained out of student pilots for 25 years. Walsh knew this would face resistance. New commanders would reject it. New instructors would call it dangerous. But he also knew 63 pilots had died in February following proper technique. He decided to test the theory. Next mission. Tomorrow if possible. March 24th. Morning briefing. 0800 hours. Walsh requested permission from Major Roberts to test a new evasive maneuver with his element. Roberts asked what kind of maneuver. Walsh explained. Deliberately uncoordinated rolls, random control inputs, unpredictable flight paths. Roberts stared at him for 10 seconds, then said it violated every principle of coordinated flight, said pilots could spin out, could lose control, could kill themselves trying to evade. Walsh argued back, said coordinated flight was getting pilots killed. Said the Germans knew the manual, knew how American pilots flew, knew how to predict every move. Said 63 dead pilots in 1 month proved the current doctrine wasn't working. Roberts considered. He was 41 years old, had flown combat in the previous war. Understood tactical innovation. He told Walsh he could run 1 test flight. Low altitude over the English Channel, no combat. Demonstrate the technique safely first. If it worked, they'd consider combat testing. Walsh took 3 pilots, Riggs, Lieutenant Frank Morrison, Lieutenant Eddie Schultz, 4 P-47s total. They took off at 09:30. Flew east to the coast. Descended to 8,000 feet over the channel. Walsh demonstrated first. Called over the radio that he'd show a standard roll. He executed it perfectly. Clean, coordinated, aileron and rudder together. The nose stayed on centerline. The P-47 rotated smoothly through 180 degrees, 2.1 seconds, textbook. Then Walsh called that he'd demonstrate an uncoordinated roll. He deliberately added too much rudder. Varied his aileron input mid-roll. Let the nose yaw off centerline. The P-47 tumbled through the sky. The roll took 4 seconds. Looked wrong, felt wrong. But that was the point. Walsh explained over the radio. Said the goal was unpredictability. Said German pilots calculated deflection shots based on predictable maneuvers. Said if the maneuver became unpredictable, deflection shooting failed. Told the other pilots to try it. Morrison went first. He was a good pilot. 18 kills, 2 years of combat experience. He tried to execute an uncoordinated roll. Struggled. His muscle memory fought against bad technique. He'd spent 500 flight hours learning coordination. His body wouldn't accept uncoordinated flight. His roll looked slightly sloppy, but still mostly predictable. Morrison called over the radio. Said this was harder than it looked. Said years of training made bad flying difficult. Walsh understood the problem. Trained pilots had ingrained habits. Good habits. Proper technique. Breaking those habits required conscious effort. Required fighting instinct. Then Riggs demonstrated. He didn't need instructions. He just flew naturally. His roll was complete chaos. Too much rudder. Not enough aileron. Nose yawing wildly. Aircraft skidding. Taking 5 seconds to complete. Perfect unpredictability. Walsh watched and realized something critical. Bad technique was harder to teach than good technique. Experienced pilots with hundreds of hours couldn't easily fly badly, but Riggs had never learned good technique. He flew chaotically because that was his natural state. Walsh spent 2 hours over the channel working with Morrison and Schultz, teaching them to unlearn coordination, teaching them to mix control inputs randomly, teaching them to vary roll rates mid-maneuver, teaching them to add random yaw. Slowly, they started to get it. Morrison's rolls became more chaotic, less predictable. Schultz managed to completely botch a barrel roll, made it look like the aircraft was damaged. Walsh called that perfect. They landed at 11:30. Walsh went immediately to Major Roberts, told him the test was successful, told him they could make American pilots unpredictable. Roberts asked the obvious question. Could they do it under combat stress? When they were scared? When Germans were shooting? When coordination was the only thing keeping them alive? Walsh said they'd find out tomorrow. The mission schedule showed bomber escort to Stuttgart. March 25th. Heavy Luftwaffe presence expected. Walsh requested permission to take his element. Test the technique in actual combat. Roberts granted permission. With conditions. If any pilot spun out, if anyone lost control, if the technique caused any American losses, Walsh would stop immediately. Walsh agreed. He spent that evening briefing his 3 pilots. Told them what to do if they got bounced. Execute random, evasive rolls. Mix control inputs. Vary roll rates. Add yaw. Make the aircraft tumble. Don't let the Germans predict where they'd be. Riggs asked if he should just fly normally. Walsh told him yes. Told him his natural flying was exactly what they needed. Morrison asked what Walsh had asked Major Roberts. What if they lost control under combat stress? Walsh answered honestly. Said he didn't know. Said the alternative was flying predictably and dying. Said 63 pilots in February proved that. Said they'd rather die trying something new than die doing what hadn't worked. The 3 pilots agreed. They'd test it tomorrow. March 25, 1944. The mission briefed at 0730. Bomber escort to Stuttgart aircraft factories. 96 B-17s. 56 P-47 escorts from the 56th Fighter Group. Expected opposition. Heavy. Intelligence reported Jagdgeschwader. 2 operating in the area. Experienced pilots. High kill rates. The group took off at 0845. Walsh's element deliberately flew loose formation. Stayed 2 miles behind the main fighter group. Made themselves visible. Made themselves targets. The idea was to attract German fighters. Test the technique under real combat conditions. They crossed into German airspace at 10:15. The radio stayed quiet for 40 minutes. Then the call came at 10:55. Bandits, 4 Fw-190s, 11 o'clock high. 6 miles out. Walsh counted them through his canopy. 4 fighters diving from 23,000 feet. His element was at 19,000. The Germans had altitude advantage, speed advantage, position advantage. Walsh keyed his radio, told his pilots to hold formation until the Germans committed. Let them get close. Then execute random rolls. At 11:20, the Fw-190s were 2,000 yards out. Committed to the attack. Walsh gave the order. Execute random rolls. Now, all 4 P-47s began tumbling through the sky. Walsh added too much rudder, varied his aileron mid-roll. His nose yawed 30 degrees left. The aircraft skidded. Morrison rolled right but mixed in elevator. His P-47 pitched up while rolling. Schultz's aircraft wallowed like a drunk. Riggs flew naturally. Complete chaos. From the ground it would have looked like 4 damaged aircraft losing control. From the German fighter's perspective, it looked impossible. The lead 4-190 pilot set up his deflection shot, aimed at Walsh. Calculated lead for a standard roll. Fired a 3-second burst. 50 rounds, all misses. Walsh's P-47 was 40 feet from where the German expected. The bullets passed through empty air. The second, Fw-190 targeted Morrison. Same calculation. Same result. Complete miss. Morrison's random roll had made his position unpredictable. The third German pilot was more experienced, later identified through radio intercepts as Hauptmann Klaus Becker. 17 kills. He recognized something was wrong. The American fighters weren't flying standard evasion patterns, weren't predictable. He called off the attack, told his wingmen to break off, climb away, find different targets. The 4 Fw-190s disengaged, climbed back to altitude. They'd fired 300 rounds combined, hit nothing. Wasted ammunition on aircraft that refused to fly predictably. Walsh's element reformed. Checked for damage. Nothing. 0 hits. 0 casualties. The random rolls had worked. Worked against experienced German pilots. Worked under combat stress. Worked when it mattered. Walsh keyed his radio. Told his pilots good job. Told them to stay alert. The mission wasn't over. But the test was successful. They'd proven the concept. Proven that unpredictability defeated deflection shooting. Proven that Riggs's terrible flying technique could save lives. They landed at Boxted at 1300 hours. Walsh went directly to Major Roberts, showed him the gun camera footage, showed the Germans firing at empty space, showed all 4 P-47s surviving without damage, told Roberts the numbers. 300 German rounds fired. 0 hits. Previous month's statistics, German hit rate against P-47s was 18%. Today, 0%. Roberts watched the footage 3 times, saw the chaotic rolls, saw the Germans missing, saw the proof. He made his decision. Told Walsh to teach the technique to the entire squadron, starting tomorrow. Told him they had 3 days. After 3 days, the whole squadron would fly combat using random evasive rolls. Walsh asked what to call it. Roberts said to call it whatever kept pilots alive. The pilots would name it themselves. By the end of the week, every pilot in the 61st Squadron would know it as the Riggs roll, the technique invented by the worst pilot in the 8th Air Force. The technique that would save hundreds of lives. The technique that started with one man who couldn't fly properly and 3 German pilots who couldn't understand why their perfect deflection shots kept missing. March 26th through 28th. 3 days of intensive training. Walsh taught the random evasive roll to 24 pilots in the 61st Fighter Squadron. Morning briefings in the ready room. Afternoon practice flights over East Anglia. Evening debriefs analysing what worked and what didn't. Walsh started each session the same way. Showed gun camera footage from March 25th. Showed German fighters firing at empty space. Showed 4 P-47s surviving through unpredictable flight. Then he explained the principle. German deflection shooting required prediction. Prediction required predictable targets. Standard maneuvers were predictable. Random, uncoordinated maneuvers were not. The mathematics were simple. If the German pilot couldn't predict where you'd be in 2.4 seconds, he couldn't hit you. Some pilots understood immediately. Lieutenant Carl Jensen had 12 kills, had survived 19 missions, had watched friends die to deflection shooting. He listened to Walsh's explanation and asked when they'd start. Other pilots were skeptical. Captain Ronald Price had been a flight instructor before the war, had taught coordination for 6 years. He told Walsh this contradicted everything the Army Air Force manual prescribed, said uncoordinated flight was dangerous, said pilots could spin out during combat. Walsh's response was direct. The manual killed 63 pilots last month. Maybe it's time we stopped following it. Price didn't argue. The training flights revealed the core problem. Experienced pilots couldn't easily fly badly. Lieutenant Morrison demonstrated. He had 18 kills, 340 combat hours, 5 years of flight training. When he tried to execute an uncoordinated roll, his muscle memory fought him. His body wanted coordination. His hands wanted smooth inputs. His feet wanted proper rudder technique. He managed sloppy rolls, but not chaotic ones, not unpredictable ones. Lieutenant David Chen had less experience. 8 kills, 120 combat hours, 2 years of training. He learned faster, could execute truly random rolls within 3 practice sessions. Walsh recognized the pattern. Newer pilots with fewer ingrained habits adapted faster. Their technique wasn't as polished. Their coordination wasn't automatic. They could more easily break the rules because they'd spent less time learning them. Riggs became an unlikely instructor. Walsh had him demonstrate the technique, repeatedly. Riggs flew his natural chaotic style, too much rudder, insufficient aileron, random yaw, complete unpredictability. The other pilots watched, studied his technique, tried to replicate the chaos. Some succeeded. Lieutenant Frank Morrison finally got it on his 16th practice roll, stopped trying to fly well, started trying to fly randomly. His P-47 tumbled through the sky. Walsh called it perfect over the radio. By March 28th, 18 of 24 pilots could execute truly unpredictable rolls. The other 6 could manage sloppy evasion. Not perfect, but better than predictable. Walsh declared them ready. March 29th would be the test. The entire squadron flying combat using the new technique. The mission briefed at 0700 hours, March 29th. Bomber escort to Brunswick, synthetic oil facilities. 104 B-17s, 64 P-47 escorts. Expected opposition, very heavy. Intelligence reported elements from Jagdgeschwader 1, Jagdgeschwader 11, and Jagdgeschwader 26 operating in the area. Potentially 120 German fighters. Major Roberts addressed the squadron before takeoff. Told them today they'd test whether random evasion worked at scale. Whether an entire squadron could survive using unpredictable flight. Told them to stay aggressive. Engage when possible. But if they got bounced, execute random rolls. Trust the technique. Trust each other. The 61st Fighter Squadron took off at 0830, 16 P-47s. Joined the bomber stream at 0945, crossed into German airspace at 1020. The first contact came at 1105. 6 Fou-190s attacking from 4 o'clock high. Walsh's element engaged. 4 P-47s versus 6 Germans. The Fw-190s dove. Walsh called the random evasion. His element began tumbling through the sky. The Germans fired. Wasted 400 rounds. Hit nothing. Walsh's wingman got a pose. Deflection shot on 1 Fw-190. The German pilot was focused on Walsh. Didn't see the wingman. Took 50 caliber rounds through his engine. Went down trailing smoke. First kill using the new technique. The engagement lasted 4 minutes. The Germans broke off. Climbed away, frustrated. 0 hits on American aircraft. Between 11:05 and 12:30, the 61st Squadron encountered German fighters 18 separate times. 18 engagements. 94 German aircraft total. Every time Americans got bounced, they executed random rolls. Every time Germans tried deflection shooting, they missed. The statistics told the story. 18 engagements. 61 Squadron aircraft used random evasion in all 18. 0 P-47s lost. 2 aircraft took minor damage. Superficial hits. Repairable. American pilots claimed 7 German fighters destroyed. 4 probables. 9 damaged. Compare that to the 62nd Fighter Squadron. They flew standard doctrine, coordinated evasion, predictable maneuvers. They encountered German fighters 12 times, lost 2 P-47s, 3 more heavily damaged, claimed 3 German kills. The difference was stark. Same mission, same enemy, different tactics, different results. The 61st Squadron landed at Boxted at 1400 hours. The pilots were celebrating. 0 losses, 7 kills. The technique worked, not just in isolated tests, at squadron scale, under maximum combat stress, against heavy opposition. Word spread through the 56th Fighter Group within 2 hours. March 30th, Colonel Hubert Zemke, 56th Fighter Group commander, called Walsh to group headquarters. Zemke was 30 years old. 12 confirmed kills. Aggressive commander. Respected innovation. Demanded results. He'd heard about the random evasion technique. Heard the 61st Squadron statistics from March 29th. Wanted details. Walsh briefed him for 90 minutes. Explained the principle. Showed gun camera footage. Presented the numbers. February 1944. Before the technique, the 61st Squadron lost aircraft at 6.8% per mission. March 29th. After the technique, 0% loss rate. Kill ratio improved from 1.3 to 1 to 7 to 0. Zemke asked the critical questions. Could it scale beyond one squadron? Could all 3 squadrons in the group learn it? Could 144 pilots execute it effectively? Walsh said yes. But training would take a week. Zemke authorized it immediately. Told Walsh to develop a training program for the entire group. 61st, 62nd, and 63rd Fighter Squadrons. 144 pilots total. Training would run April 1st through 5th. Combat test April 6th. Walsh spent March 31st designing the curriculum. 6 hours of instruction per pilot, 2 hours ground school, 4 hours flight training. He divided pilots into experience levels. Veterans with 200+ combat hours in one group. Intermediate pilots with 50 to 200 hours in another. New pilots with less than 50 hours in a third group. Each group needed different instruction. Veterans needed to unlearn coordination. Intermediate pilots needed refinement. New pilots needed basic technique. Rigs would demonstrate for all groups. The worst pilot teaching the best pilots. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. April 1st. Training began. Walsh briefed 72 pilots in the morning session. explained deflection, shooting mathematics, explained why predictability meant death, showed the March 29th statistics, showed gun camera footage of Germans missing repeatedly. Some pilots were immediately convinced, others remained skeptical. One captain asked the question many were thinking. If this technique is so effective, why aren't the Germans using it? Walsh's answer was simple. Because they're winning. Their deflection shooting works. They've been killing Allied pilots for 4 years using current tactics. They have no incentive to change. We do. 63 dead pilots in February is our incentive. The afternoon flight training revealed the same patterns Walsh had seen in his squadron. Experienced pilots struggled to fly badly. Their coordination was too ingrained, their technique too polished. They could manage sloppy rolls, but not chaotic ones. Newer pilots learned faster, less muscle memory to overcome, less training to unlearn. By April 3rd, 96 of 144 pilots could execute truly unpredictable evasion. The remaining 48 could manage sufficient chaos to disrupt deflection shooting. Not perfect, but workable. Zemke added his own refinement to the technique. He told pilots to combine random rolls with the P-47's natural advantage. Dive speed. When bounced from above, execute random roll while diving. The combination compounded unpredictability. The German pilot had to calculate deflection for a tumbling target that was also accelerating downward. Nearly impossible. The technique evolved beyond Walsh's original concept, became doctrine specifically optimized for P-47 characteristics. April 6, 1944. The 56th Fighter Group flew its first full-group mission using random evasion doctrine. Target, Focke-Wulf aircraft factories at Oschersleben. 112 B-17s, 48 P-47s from the 56th. Expected opposition, maximum. The Germans would defend aircraft factories aggressively. Intelligence estimated 80-plus enemy fighters. The group crossed into German airspace at 10:40. First contact came at 11:15. 12 W-190s diving from altitude. The 61st Squadron engaged. Random rolls. The Germans fired. Missed. Wasted 600 rounds. The 62nd Squadron encountered 16 Bf 109s at 11:30. Executed random evasion, combined with diving, attacks. The Bf 109s couldn't establish deflection shots. The American pilots got 3 kills, 0 losses. Between 11:15 and 1300 hours, the 56th Fighter Group encountered German fighters 47 separate times. 47 engagements involving 133 German aircraft. American pilots executed random evasion in every engagement. The results were unprecedented. 3 P-47s damaged. Minor hits, all 3 returned to base, 0 destroyed, 0 pilots killed. American pilots claimed 14 German fighters destroyed, 9 probables, 16 damaged. But the statistics that mattered were the loss rates. Previous month average for the 56th Fighter Group, 6.8% losses per mission. April 6th, 0%. Same enemy. Same opposition levels. Different tactics. The mathematics proved the technique worked at group scale. 48 aircraft using random evasion. 47 combat engagements. 0 losses. Colonel Zemke filed a combat report that evening. Described the random evasion technique. Provided statistics. Recommended immediate adoption across 8th Air Force Fighter Command. The report reached 8th Fighter Command headquarters at High Wycombe within 18 hours. The Germans noticed by mid-April. Luftwaffe combat reports from Jagdgeschwader 1, Jagdgeschwader 2, and Jagdgeschwader 11 all mentioned similar observations. American Thunderbolts flying erratically, tumbling through the sky, making deflection shooting difficult. Some reports described American aircraft as damaged, others recognized the pattern as deliberate. Oberleutnant Franz Stigler, 28 kills, filed a report April 10th, stated that American fighters had begun executing uncoordinated evasive maneuvers that disrupted standard deflection shooting techniques. Hauptmann Klaus Becker analyzed the trend. He'd encountered the technique twice, March 25th and April 8th. Both times his deflection shots missed. Both times American aircraft tumbled unpredictably. He wrote in his combat assessment that the Americans were deliberately flying without coordination, making their flight paths impossible to predict. Recommended German pilots adjust tactics. The Luftwaffe Training Command studied the reports, issued tactical guidance April 15th. Recommended 3 countermeasures. First, close-range shooting. Get within 400 yards. Reduce prediction time. Less time for Americans to evade unpredictably. Second, multiple aircraft firing simultaneously. Saturate the space. Increase probability of hits through volume. Third, high-speed diving attacks. Less time for target to react. The countermeasures had limited success. Close-range shooting worked occasionally, but closing to 400 yards increased German pilots' risk. Got them into range of American defensive fire. Multiple aircraft firing simultaneously wasted ammunition. The Luftwaffe was already facing ammunition shortages. High-speed diving attacks reduced German maneuverability, made the German fighters predictable, made them vulnerable to American wingmen. By late April, experienced German pilots were avoiding the 56th Fighter Group when possible. Radio intercepts captured conversations between Luftwaffe controllers and fighter pilots. Controllers vectoring fighters toward bomber formations. Pilots asking which American fighter group was escorting. If controllers said 56th, some pilots requested different targets. The psychological impact was measurable. German pilots who dominated the sky for 4 years were now uncertain, hesitant. Their mastery of deflection shooting no longer guaranteed kills. April 15th. 8th Air Force Fighter Command completed statistical analysis. Compared loss rates before and after the 56th Fighter Group adopted random evasion. January through March 1944, before the technique, 56th Fighter Group average. Loss rate was 6.8% per mission. April 1st through 15th, after full adoption, 2.1%. Simultaneously, other fighter groups using standard tactics maintained loss rates, averaging 5.7%. The difference was undeniable. Same missions, same enemy, same conditions. The 56th Fighter Group was losing 63% fewer aircraft than other groups. Kill ratios showed similar improvement. January through March, 56th Fighter Group kill ratio was 1.4 American kills per German loss. April 1st through 15th, 3.2 to 1. The technique wasn't just preventing losses, it was enabling American pilots to survive long enough to get kills. Brigadier General William Kepner, 8th Fighter Command Commander, convened a meeting April 18th, High Wycombe Headquarters. Present were all fighter group commanders. Colonel Zemke briefed the random evasion technique. Captain Walsh provided tactical details, demonstrated with his hands how pilots mixed control inputs, showed gun camera footage, presented statistics. Some commanders were immediately convinced, others expressed concern. Colonel James Howard from the 4th Fighter Group questioned whether teaching uncoordinated flight would degrade overall pilot skill. Said coordination was fundamental to safe flying. Walsh responded with a question. How many pilots did the 4th Fighter Group lose last month? Howard checked his records. 8 pilots. Walsh asked how many the 56th lost in April using random evasion. Zemke answered. 2. Both from non-combat accidents, 0 combat losses. The room went quiet. General Kepner made his decision. Every fighter group in 8 Fighter Command would adopt random evasion doctrine. Training would begin April 20th. Implementation deadline, May 1st. The technique that started with 1 terrible pilot in 1 squadron would become standard operating procedure for 15 fighter groups, 1,500 pilots. The 8th Air Force was changing how it fought based on Tommy Riggs's inability to fly properly. April 20th through 30th. 8th Air Force Fighter Command implemented random evasion training across 15 fighter groups. 60 training instructors deployed from the 56th Fighter Group to other units. Walsh spent 2 weeks at the 4th Fighter Group, taught 120 pilots. Morrison went to the 352nd Fighter Group. Riggs stayed at Boxted, demonstrated for visiting instructors who would teach their own squadrons. But resistance came from an unexpected source: Army Air Force Training Command, headquarters at Fort Worth, Texas. They reviewed the random evasion technique in late April, read the combat reports, studied the statistics, and objected. Colonel Richard Turner, chief flight instructor at Training Command, filed a formal dissent May 2nd. His argument was simple: random evasion contradicted fundamental flight principles. Teaching pilots to fly uncoordinated was dangerous, created bad habits, degraded overall skill. Turner argued the technique might work short-term, but would create long-term problems. New pilots learning uncoordinated flight first would never master proper coordination, would be unsafe in non-combat situations, would crash during training or routine flights. The debate reached Army Air Force headquarters in Washington. General Henry Arnold, commanding general, ordered an evaluation, sent a team to England. Colonel Turner led the team personally. They arrived May 8th, spent 2 weeks observing 56th Fighter Group operations. Turner watched training flights, interviewed pilots, reviewed maintenance records for evidence of increased accidents, watched gun camera footage from 20 combat missions, saw Germans missing repeatedly, saw American pilots surviving impossible situations. On May 14th, Turner interviewed Riggs personally, found him in the crew room reading a letter from home, asked him basic questions. "How did you develop this technique?" Riggs answered honestly. Said he didn't develop anything. Said he just flew badly. Said the Germans couldn't predict bad flying. Turner watched Riggs demonstrate, watched him tumble through the sky like a drunk, watched the complete absence of coordination. Turner's official report filed May 20th stated the technique was aerodynamically unsound but tactically effective, acknowledged the survival statistics proved validity, recommended controlled implementation. Teach new pilots proper coordination first, then teach when to deliberately break the rules. Advanced combat training only, not basic flight school. The compromise satisfied Training Command concerns. Random evasion would enter the curriculum, but as an advanced technique, not a replacement for fundamental skills. By summer 1944, the technique had become standard across Allied air forces. Royal Air Force Fighter Command adopted a modified version for Spitfires and Typhoons in June. Called it Random Break Maneuver. Same principle. Unpredictable evasion to defeat deflection shooting. 9th Air Force Tactical Fighter Groups implemented it for ground attack missions. Found it effective against German anti-aircraft fire. Flak gunners predicted aircraft flight paths the same way fighter pilots did. Random evasion made those predictions impossible. The Germans continued attempting counter-tactics through summer. Luftwaffe training schools taught patience. Wait for straight flight moments. Don't commit to deflection shots on tumbling targets. Some success. But Allied fighters rarely flew straight in combat zones anymore. German pilots who waited for straight flight often never got their shots. Another German tactic emerged by August: target bombers instead of fighters. Acknowledge they couldn't reliably kill Allied fighters using deflection shooting anymore. Focus on destroying bombers before fighter escort arrived. But that strategy failed too, because American fighters stayed with the bombers, protected them aggressively. The overall air superiority shifted decisively to the Allies. Multiple factors contributed. Numerical superiority. The Americans were building aircraft faster than Germany could replace losses. Fuel shortages. German synthetic oil production was collapsing under Allied bombing. Pilot attrition. Experienced Luftwaffe pilots were dying. Replacements had minimal training, but random evasion contributed measurably. Made American pilots harder to kill, let them survive long enough to gain experience, turned survival rates from 34% to 67% for pilots flying 50 mission tours. Hans Philipp, German ace with 208 kills, died June 8, 1944, shot down by a P-47. The American pilot had executed a random roll. Philip's deflection shot missed. The American's wingman got Philip from above. A veteran, Ace died because his mastery of deflection shooting no longer guaranteed kills. August 1944. 8th Air Force Operations Research completed comprehensive statistical analysis. Compared loss rates before and after random evasion adoption. January through March 1944. Before the technique, 312 P-47s lost in combat. Average loss rate 5.9% per mission. May through July 1944, after widespread adoption, 187 P-47s lost. Average loss rate 3.1%. But those numbers didn't account for increased sortie rates. The 8th Air Force was flying more missions in summer than winter. When analysts adjusted for sortie numbers, the effective reduction was 47% fewer losses per combat encounter. Conservative estimates suggested the technique saved 125 pilots in 4 months. But compound effects were larger. Saved pilots flew more missions, trained newer pilots, passed knowledge to replacements. The actual impact was probably 300+ lives saved by summer. June 19th. Walsh received promotion to major. Given command of the 63rd Fighter Squadron, received the Distinguished Flying Cross. The citation read, "For extraordinary achievement in the development of evasive tactics that significantly improved pilot survival rates and contributed to Allied air superiority over Europe." Riggs received the Air Medal in July, not for developing the technique, for completing 50 combat missions. The medal was standard, given to any pilot who completed 50 missions. Walsh pushed for Riggs to receive the Distinguished Flying Cross. Filed formal recommendation with Group Headquarters. Wrote that Riggs's innovation had saved more lives than most aces' combat records. Command denied the request. The response stated they did not award medals for poor flying technique regardless of tactical results. Walsh's reply was logged in official correspondence. His bad flying saved more pilots than all the good flying in February combined. The denial stood, but other pilots knew the truth. Knew Tommy Two Hands had changed fighter combat. Knew the worst pilot in the squadron had saved lives through sheer incompetence that accidentally became genius. September 1944. Riggs completed 75 combat missions. His record remained unimpressive by traditional standards. 5 confirmed kills, all accidental. All occurring when his random evasion rolls put him in position to fire instinctively. 75 missions flown. 0 serious damage to his aircraft. Never wounded. Never forced to bail out. Never even took hits that required more than 12 hours of maintenance. Statistical miracle. The 8th Air Force calculated that pilots flying 75 missions had 18% completion rate. Most were killed, wounded, or shot down before reaching 50 missions. Riggs reached 75 without incident. His survival wasn't luck. It was unpredictability. The Germans could never predict where he'd be because Riggs himself didn't know where he'd be. His chaotic flying was perfect evasion, perfect survival technique. The war ended May 8, 1945. Riggs returned to the United States, June 1945. 77 combat missions total. Final record was 6 kills, 0 losses, 0 serious damage. He returned to Terre Haute, Indiana, back to his job at Marsh Supermarket, stocking shelves, running the register, living quietly. He married September 1st, 1945. Helen Morrison from Indianapolis. They had 3 children, 2 daughters and a son. Riggs never talked about the war. When neighbors asked, he'd say he flew fighters, say he survived. Nothing more. He worked at the same grocery store for 38 years. Retired 1983. Lived quietly in a small house on 8th Street. Watched his grandchildren grow up. Never mentioned that he'd changed how fighter pilots flew. Never mentioned that hundreds of pilots survived because he couldn't execute a proper role. Walsh stayed in the Air Force. Served through Korea. Retired 1963 as Brigadier General. Wrote tactical manuals during his career. published definitive work on fighter combat 1956. Included a chapter on unpredictable evasion, credited Riggs by name, called him the pilot who proved that perfect technique wasn't always the answer. Korean War pilots adapted random evasion for jet combat. F-86 Sabre pilots used it against MiG-15s. Same principle worked at 600 miles per hour as at 300. Unpredictability defeated deflection shooting, regardless of speed. Vietnam War. 4 Phantom pilots learned the technique. Modified for supersonic flight. Used against North Vietnamese MiG-17s and MiG-21s. The principle never changed. Make your flight path impossible to predict. Modern fighter doctrine still teaches random brake maneuvers. Top Gun. Fighter Weapons School. Every military aviation program in NATO. The core concept traces directly to March 23, 1944, to one terrible pilot who couldn't execute a coordinated role. 1982. Air Force historian researching 8th Air Force tactical innovations. Found Walsh's correspondence. Found references to Riggs's role. Tracked down Riggs in Terre Haute. Found him at age 60, still working part-time at the grocery. Asked him if he knew his technique had changed fighter combat. Riggs said he was just trying not to get shot. Said he didn't know anyone paid attention. The historian estimated Riggs's technique saved 300 pilots during World War II. Compound effects over following decades, possibly 1,000 lives influenced by the doctrine that emerged from his chaotic flying. Riggs died January 14, 1998. Age 76. Heart attack. Quick, painless. His obituary in the Terre Haute Tribune-Star mentioned his World War II service, mentioned his 3 children and 6 grandchildren, mentioned his 38 years at Marsh Supermarket. One paragraph mentioned he flew 77 combat missions as a P-47 pilot. Did not mention he invented a tactical innovation that saved hundreds of lives. Did not mention that the worst pilot in the 8th Air Force changed how every air force in the world taught fighter combat. Walsh died May 3, 2009, age 89. His funeral at Arlington National Cemetery drew 40 former pilots, men he'd trained, men he'd commanded, men whose lives he'd saved by recognizing that Riggs's incompetence was actually innovation. Walsh's son shared his father's last words about Riggs at the funeral. Best pilot I ever flew with. Couldn't fly for damn. But he saved more lives than any ace I knew. The National Museum of the United States Air Force has no exhibit on Tommy Riggs. No display explaining how random evasion doctrine emerged. No recognition of the grocery clerk from Indiana who proved that sometimes survival comes from breaking every rule. But fighter pilots know. Every pilot taught unpredictable evasion learns the story eventually. Learns about the worst pilot who accidentally became the most influential. Innovation doesn't always come from excellence. Sometimes it comes from incompetence that solves problems excellence couldn't fix. Tommy Riggs flew like he was drunk. The Germans couldn't predict drunk, and 300 pilots came home because of it. If this story moved you, hit that like button right now. Every like helps us share these forgotten histories with more people who need to hear them. Subscribe and turn on notifications. We're bringing you stories every week about the people who changed history without ever making the headlines. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Texas, Australia, Germany, Japan. Our community spans the globe. You're not just watching, you're keeping these memories alive. Thank you for making sure Tommy Riggs and the hundreds of pilots he saved aren't forgotten. These men deserve to be remembered. And you're making that happen.